midnight on December the 31st, 1947, every steam locomotive in Britain sounded their whistle. A New Year's Eve tribute, you might think. Wrong. A much more momentous occasion. This whistle chorus was the way thousands of workers marked the most radical shake-up Britain's railways had ever seen. Nationalisation. By the end of the war, the railways were overused and under-maintained. Like the rest of the country, they were knackered. What was needed was a radical rethink. Nationalisation was part of the newly elected Labour Party's promise to the electorate. Massive state funding. In 1947, the Transport Act was passed. The overworked, dilapidated railways were about to have new life breathed into them. Just as the canals had once had their heyday and the motorways would come to have theirs, this was the era of rail freight. The locomotive was king. The man appointed to the difficult task of heading the railway executive that would run British Rail was R.A. Riddles, a London, Midland and Scottish engineer, very much in the pre-war tradition of the autocratic chief mechanical engineer. An old-style gaffer. Riddles had a great track record. As assistant to the steam engineer William Stanier, he'd helped design the famous Coronation class engine. Then, during the war, he kept Britain's railways running with cheap, easy-to-maintain locomotives known as austerity engines, specially designed to run on low-grade coal and poorly maintained tracks. Riddles inherited a staggering diversity of steam engines. Over 20,000 locos of 448 different types. The biggest question facing him now was which type of motive power would be best for the future of Britain's railways. Other countries were doing away with steam in favour of diesel and electrification. Some were even experimenting with gas turbines. Riddles was sure that electricity offered the long-term solution, but that was very expensive, and in those post-war years, diesel was really the only other option. The railway executive, under Riddles, decided to stick with steam. And with good reason. Britain's built on coal, it's cheap. Fuel oil imported for diesels is expensive. Plus, in 1948, the pressure was on to get Britain moving again as quickly as possible. The infrastructure for steam was already in place and had been so for over 100 years. It was familiar, it worked, it was safe. Water supplies, coal yards, ash pits, locomotive sheds and turntables. It would have been almost impossible for Riddles to turn his back on all that. And besides, there was the workforce to consider. Steam men were amongst the most experienced and loyal of workers. They loved their steam locomotives, however war-battered they were. Once the decision had been made to stick with steam, Riddles faced his next problem. The locomotives he inherited were of a bewildering variety based on Victorian principles of engineering and very, very labour-intensive. He needed to standardise. He needed 12 varieties of locomotive across the whole system to deal with all eventualities. Passenger, freight, mixed passenger and freight, egg, beans, chips. This is a Riddles design, one of his standardised locomotives, a 4MT. You need locomotives of different weights and strengths to pull different loads over different terrains. And this one is a sort of mid-range workhorse designed for mixed traffic, and it embodies all of Riddles' principles. Accessibility, interchangeability of parts, and the same layout. And the best place you can see that is in the cab. The driver's controls are standardised and rationalised. Vacuum brake, steam brake, regulator, reversing lever. And there's another Riddles engine over there. This is a standard tank, another class 4. Vacuum brake, steam brake, regulator, reverser, snap. And this is Riddle's masterpiece, the 9F. F for freight. We're used to lauded locomotives being passenger express locos, but this one was just for freight originally. And that's why it's got so many wheels, lots of traction. It's a wonderful piece of pragmatic, practical engineering, and it was much loved by engineers and drivers alike. For a start off, there are only 2 cylinders. On the outside, incredibly accessible, but there was no sacrifice to power or speed. It doesn't even look like a British loco. Everything's exposed. It's all bolted on the outside. Since the Stephensons, chief mechanical engineers had spent all their energy trying to hide anything to keep clean, smooth lines on their locos. But some things didn't change. These oilers have cork stoppers, as did the first locomotives. The cab itself is an exercise in design efficiency. As well as being painted black, like the rest of the engine, everything was standardised. Riddles even consulted the train crews on the layout of the cab. He got rid of all the fiddly brass and bits of decoration and utilised all the latest labour-saving devices, like the rocking grate. The firebed could be agitated, and then at the end of the day steaming, the fire could be emptied from the cab.
Simple engines, simple to maintain and simple to operate. But even as the revolutionary 9F and Standards fleet were being constructed, the new Conservative government under Macmillan was losing interest. Motorways were now the thing. They scrapped the railway executive as a cumbersome bureaucracy and set up regional boards to manage British Rail. Public money was diverted into privatised road transport, not railways, and this, many believe, is where the rot set in, the root of all the problems we have today. But in withdrawing their support for steam, they did have a point. Right across Europe, it was out with steam and in with diesel.
Ash, clinker, char, scale, soot. Steam locomotives are romantic things, but they are very dirty and very labour intensive. It might have been every boy's dream to be an engine driver, but the night shift engine cleaner wasn't quite the thing. This is the last remaining coaling station in Britain. There would have been these all over the country, wetting the coal because the incredible amount of dust produced. And then this whole truck is wheeled up and tipped into the tender. It's dirty and it's hard work. Wouldn't want to have to do that all day for 10 pence. And then, at the end of every day, the smoke box would need to be cleaned out. That would be full of soot and ash, and the boiler tubes would need to be cleaned. Hot, dirty, very manual.
In Britain, the government was anxious to be part of this modernisation. They hated the amount of money and manpower that was needed to keep the old steam engines running.
With a diesel locomotive, when you want to change direction, you get out of the cab, take your dead man's handle, walk down the platform and get in the other cab. They're double-ended. Steam locomotives aren't. They've got a front and a back. Going forward, you can go 75 miles per hour. But if you're running tender first, you can only go 45. Those are the rules. So, you have to turn it round. You put it on a turntable and you turn it round. All 100-odd tons of it. Takes time and effort and sweat.
The days of the steam loco were over. But given that the life expectancy of one of these engines is around 40 years, many in the industry were outraged at the waste caused by the premature scrapping that was to follow.
The 9Fs never recouped their investment. They were all withdrawn far too early. Because even while they were under construction, the diesel lobby had won. It was a foregone conclusion in many people's minds that diesel traction was the way forward, despite experiments by steam engineers that proved that steam could be more efficient than contemporary diesels. Steam was seen as dirty, inefficient, and even worse than that, old-fashioned. The last steam loco to be built for British Rail was a 9F, and it got its name through a competition won by 2 British Rail employees. And they came up with the name Evening Star. The Morning Star was a Stevenson loco supplied for the GWR. Even the employees of British Rail felt sad. Steam had come full circle. Morning Star to Evening Star.
150 years of steam had come to an end. The new diesel era was dawning.
This is Barrow Hill Roundhouse. It was completed in 1870 as a steam locomotive shed. And it houses this, a turntable, which acts as an engine jukebox. It can select any one of 24 locomotives grouped round it, hence Roundhouse. Fire up, please.
The first diesel engine was invented in Germany in the 1890s, but it wasn't until the mid-1930s that it became commonplace on Europe's railways. Not only were they pretty useful in shunting yards, but the fastest passenger service at the time was powered by a diesel. It had the unlikely name of the Flying Hamburger, and it beat Britain's fastest steam service, the Cheltenham Flyer, by an average 6 miles per hour. The real difference, though, was in the fuel economy. You get 6 times as much power per unit of fuel from a diesel than you do from a steam engine.
Unlike the shunters, which still resemble steam locos because they've got a cab at the back and they run forward, this diesel electric, built in 1959, the year of my birth, in Loughborough, a Class 31, has a cab at either end. It can go as fast forwards as it can backwards. In fact, the concept of forward and backward doesn't apply anymore. So, you don't need any special facilities like you do to turn a big steam loco. So it's goodbye turntable. But the most important thing about a diesel electric loco like this is it's almost instant power. All that power in there, and all you have to do is turn a key, pull a lever, and press a button. May I, Mervyn?
Indeed, yeah.
Thank you very much. And it started. Masses and masses of instant power. So,
immediately you've lost all that labour intensity. You don't have to raise a fire in the morning. You don't have to start hours before the loco has to move in order to raise steam. You don't have the huge cleaning problems. It is relatively cleaner. You don't have to water. You don't, I mean, you have to add diesel, but you don't have this whole problem of coaling. It's just in a completely different area as far as labour intensity.
I mean, for a fireman, it must have been heaven. Not only did he not have to deal with huge amounts of muck, but he got this fantastic position here, because you still had a second man, obviously. It's fully enclosed. I've got my own window. I've got an ashtray, should I decide to have a cigarette. I've got windscreen wipers. Mind you, do you miss the old fire? The Class 31 diesel electric marked a huge turning point. More efficiency meant fewer jobs. In the 20 years after its introduction, 400,000 railwaymen were laid off. For the drivers who remained, it was a bit like moving from the shop floor to the gaffer's office. Warmer, quieter, cleaner, and a lot more power. Listen to this. The horn is like a toggle switch, and you've got two tones. That is a proper big lad's horn. Being a modern engine, it came with the very latest in domestic appliances, like this nice little hot plate for making a quick brew. All powered by this huge diesel-electric engine.
This is a diesel-electric engine. It's a rather tasty V12. This isn't a waste paper bin. This is a piston. Large, isn't it? The sump is the size of 2 baths. It should be. It produces 1,750 horsepower. But it doesn't drive the wheels. It drives this. This is a generator. This generator is bolted onto the crankshaft of the diesel V12. This generates electricity, which is fed to traction motors, which drive the wheels of the engine. It is ingenious. The locomotive is a mobile power station.
The Class 31 evolved into this, the more powerful Class 47, launched in 1962. It's one of British Rail's most successful locomotives. 300 were built in its first 20 years, modified into 10 basic types with hundreds of detail variations. But prepare to worship at the shrine of one of the most powerful diesel-electric engines ever built. If the Class 47 was the maid of all work and the sensible approach to diesel locomotive building, then these huge engines represent the opposite. Built by English Electric, the makers of supersonic aircraft, just 22 of these twin-engine Deltics replaced 55 steam locomotives on the East Coast route to Scotland. Driving this loco, perched on top of 3,300 horsepower, must have felt like piloting a jet fighter. But in the end, the Deltics were too specialist. They were described by British Railways Chief Mechanical Engineer as excellent in performance, but a maintenance menace. With 2 engines, the Deltics cost twice as much to maintain as a normal diesel-electric.
Which is why they were outlasted by the excellent, if conventional, Class 47s, some of which are stored here, mothballed at Barrow Hill, for use in emergency on the main line. But passenger trains aren't hauled by locomotives anymore. Their power units are part of the train itself. Fixed formation trains, they're called. And most British freight trains are hauled by Class 66 locomotives, built in Canada. To some, that might be no great loss. When R.A. Riddles, the man who started the modernisation programme in 1948, first rode on the footplate of an electric locomotive, he was asked what it was like. He said, "I didn't really notice. The driver was an old steam man. We talked about steam engines all the time."
In 1963, a Dr. Beeching famously wrote a report entitled The Reshaping of British Railways. In it, he proposed cutting uneconomic lines, and as a result, some 5,000 miles of track were abandoned. People still argue about whether it was a good thing or not, but one thing is for sure. In his bid for modernisation, Beeching accidentally ensured the survival of the steam locomotive, because those abandoned tracks have provided a permanent home to steam railway preservation societies. In the early 1990s, the Conservative government took the post-war cuts even further. British Rail was privatised and fragmented, and roads given even higher priority. To many, a disastrous move. But despite all the problems, there is light at the end of the tunnel. We are moving, however slowly, towards the high-speed electrification that British Rail's first boss, Robert Riddles, envisaged. Now, if we choose, we can have breakfast in London and lunch in another European capital. Trains are getting faster and more efficient. This is the future of rail travel. I wonder what Richard Trevithick would have made of it.
Fire up, please.